Okay. So these are some of the teams or departments that we have at TASA, just so y'all know a little bit more about our organization. So we have a team called Regional Support, and they are spread out all across Texas. So if you look at this image right here on the right, these are the different regions. This is how we have separated the state of Texas. So for example, we have someone in El Paso, we have someone in San Angelo, we have someone in the Dallas area, in Plano, we have someone in Houston, we have someone um, in San Antonio. And actually, I think San Antonio is the furthest south we have someone currently. So hopefully, moving forward, we have somebody even further south Texas, because we know that we see Region F, there is a lot more area that needs to be covered. But they are a remote team, so they primarily work virtually, but especially like after COVID, but pre-COVID, they would travel all over the region and they can do in-person TA. They provide program support. So you don't only have access to the prevention team, but there's a whole other team of folks that you even have access to. So for example, Alex, you have access to Hale, who is the person for your region. Um, Let me think. All our Laredo folks in Corpus Christi, y'all have access to Rick if y'all don't know who he is, and we can send, or I can send y'all their information after. But and they do more like broad. Um, it's not very specific to prevention, but they can get you connected with organizations in your area. And they do even statewide training. Virtually or pre-COVID in person too. We have our public policy team who does a lot of legislative work, and we even had someone on that team who was working with incarcerated survivors and doing advocacy with them. We currently have someone working as a survivor, working with the Survivor Advisory Board, who meets with the governor's office and is really an advocate for survivors and really gets their voice heard and represents them and gives them a seat at the table. We have our learning and evaluation team, which primarily does like a lot of data, right? Like they are our data people, they're our evaluation people. And they're the ones that create our evaluations agency wide. But from that team, they have created another, I guess, like group or a team within that team. And not everyone from the learning evaluation team is in the Collective Healing Initiative. I'm actually a member of the Collective Healing Initiative. And what that is, it's a group of women of color. It's a BIPOC specific group, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color group. And what we really are doing is looking for other healing modalities for survivors of color, right? So we know that not all survivors of color seek out local agencies. They don't seek out rape crisis centers because the healing services that they're providing are not culturally resonant, right? So we want something that connects with people of color on a more from a cultural grounding, right? So that's another team, an initiative that we have going on at TASA. If you are a person of color in this space and you're interested in attending events, we have online events that we host. If you're interested in being a part of that group, send me a private message, and then we can get you on that email list for sure. And then we have the primary prevention team, which is our team. And we have two funding streams that we get. We have our block grantees, which Emiliano primarily works with. And those are folks who are doing more direct service. So he supports folks who are doing counseling, who are answering the hotline, right? And he, a lot of his work centers around, and we'll talk about this in a second, but around male survivorship and engaging men in this work. And then last but not least, we have the RPE grant. So Madison, Melanie, Tim, and I are working under this grant, and we provide technical assistance, training, and support to y'all. And that is our role. There are a couple other teams that are not listed on here because, you know, they're not like a super like cohesive team. Like everyone's role is like really different. So for example, we have our operations team, and folks on that team, their scope of work ranges anywhere from folks who are doing like financial stuff, who like provide reimbursements for people. It's how we get folks paid, who do webinars for us and things like that. And then we have folks who are doing like the admin side of just, you know, how running the office. And I'm super excited about this team, even though I'm not a part of this team personally, but it's our bilingual team. TASA has been super intentional about language justice, specifically in the past few years, and especially in online spaces. So if any of y'all have attended our TASA conferences, especially in the past 2 years, you might have noticed that we have interpreters in those spaces because it's a value of TASA that especially for monolingual Spanish speakers, that they're hearing content in real time, right? Like that it's not an afterthought. It's like we want to provide services for folks who English isn't their first language. And we're also working to expand that to include other languages. But right now our focus is serving Spanish speaking folks across the state. And if you want to learn more about this, you can contact Denise Loya at TASA, and I will actually drop her email in case this is something that y'all are interested in learning more about, or, you know, really implementing this in your agency. So that is her email. Have they updated the flyers, or are they still the same ones? So we're in the process of updating our flyers, but we haven't actually, our brochures. So we're in that process, and we've been in the process of updating our brochures. It feels like for a couple years now, but they're not done. So I will say that because I know the ones that y'all have, if you have our brochures at your agencies, they're outdated. That's just facts. But we're hoping to get those out by this year. So this is some of the TASA fam. This is the photo from our 2019 TASA conference that was hosted in San Antonio. This was our last in-person conference, and you know, we're so excited to hopefully get to do this again this year. In Houston is actually where we're going to be hosting the conference, if, you know, fingers crossed, everything goes as planned and COVID, you know, slows down, because we've had that recent surge and it's spreading like wildfire. But these are folks that, you know, were employed with TASA at the 2019 TASA conference. Some of these people have moved on, and we've also gained a lot of awesome TASA peeps. But we are, you know, just looking forward to the next conference that we're going to get to be back in person with y'all face to face. We're super excited about that. Shameless plug. We're also currently accepting workshop submissions if you're interested in presenting at our TASA conference. And we're going to be accepting submissions up until the end of the month. And we're super excited about the content that's going to be shared at this year's conference. This year is TASA's 40th anniversary. So the theme for this conference is Look Who's 40. And it's reflecting on the past, looking forward to a brighter future. So that's kind of like what our, the theme of like the workshops are going to be around, you know, really reflecting on where we've been and where we're going, just to give y'all a little bit like a teaser of what to expect. So historically, we have had a prevention track. So we're hoping that, you know, to keep that prevention track alive, and that y'all will submit something. But this is also not a requirement. Like, you're not required to attend this conference. It's not like the Prevention Institute that if you're receiving prevention funding, specifically RPE funding, you are required to attend our Prevention Institute. But this is just something more, it's not a requirement, it's just additional, right? And you know, it's just a great opportunity to network and get to learn about the work that folks are doing in the movement more broadly. So this is an interdisciplinary conference. We have folks who do law enforcement. We have folks who do policy and legislative work. We have counselors. We have SANE nurses, which are the nurses at the hospital that do the sexual assault exams. We have folks there who are leaders at the university level doing Title IX work. So it's really a range of people who attend the conference. And we want prevention to have a strong presence, right? Because prevention, a lot of times, as we know, gets siloed. We kind of get put, you know, like we're something over here, you know, but prevention is just as important as all this other stuff. We also provide workshops in Spanish. We have wellness workshops. So it's something that I personally look forward to every year, and I hope to see some of y'all at the conference this year. But no pressure. So this is the prevention team. Each one of us submitted a Bitmoji that we felt like captured our personality. So that's why they're like he tries his hard to spaces and prevention spaces, but he just has a lot going on that he can't always make it to the spaces. But he totally has long hair and wears his hair in a bun every single day. So that is like super representative of him. Then we have Melanie, who is a ball of energy. Those of y'all who know Melanie, you know that she is on it. She brings it all the time. So I feel like that emoji is like the perfect representation of like her personality. Then you got me, which is like a complete 180 from Melanie's. But the past few years, I've been doing a lot of introspection work, a lot of like inner work. So I feel like that just that picture kind of, you know, symbolizes my personality as of late in the past few years. Then we have Madison, who is super, super kind. She's literally probably the nicest person I have ever met. And, you know, that's the Bitmoji she wanted to, she felt like embodies her personality the most. And then last but not least, we have Emiliano, who is our men's engagement specialist. He's such a good guy and he's awesome at all things social media. So that is really representative of him. If any of y'all follow him on Instagram or anything, you see that he gets asked a lot of times to like be on podcasts, or like he's really always promoting things about men's engagement and male survivorship. He even has his own initiative that he's working on, like at TASA. It's called Texas Men Speak. So if you know any men who are in this movement who are wanting to connect with any other men, reach out to him, and he'll get you connected with that. So P-Rex says, welcome. P-Rex, if you don't know, you've never seen him before or anything, is our unofficial official mascot. So I wish I knew a little bit more about the origin story of P-Rex, but they were created before I joined the team. And in case you haven't noticed or really caught on, P-Rex stands for Prevention Rex. And it's even like, you know, they look like their shape is almost like in the letter P too. And I will say that P-Rex is definitely a part of our team, and they try to make an appearance in prevention spaces, especially at the Prevention Institute. You can always guarantee that they will make an appearance. I will also say that P-Rex is the friendliest dinosaur you will ever meet. Any questions about anything I've covered so far? Let's keep this train moving. Okay, so now, y'all, right? Prevention years. We talk about prevention years all the time, right? So here is a formal definition of what a prevention year is. So a prevention year is a person, animal, or supernatural being who work to prevent sexual violence in Texas. discovering and leading primary prevention in the Texas frontier. A prevention year is also the embodiment of all things social justice with an eagerness to play while working. So if you've been in any spaces with us, you know that we always want to include some sort of activity or icebreaker, or something fun in the work that we're doing. And especially for those of you who are working with young people, this is super important, right? You want this work to be fun so that people want to participate in your programming. But this is just a cute definition for prevention year that we came up with as a team. You may also hear folks reference prevention years as prevention workers, but we think prevention year sounds a little more cool, especially, given that we're in Texas. Has a little Southern twang to it. Prevention year sounds cooler than prevention worker, right? At least in my opinion, it does. So one day, Melanie came up to us and was just like, what does being a preventioneer mean to you, right? And these were some of the answers that we came up with. Madison said, we are resilient enough through the bad. We are hopeful enough to see the good. We are realistic enough to know that the progress made is slow, but it is strong, steadfast, and sure. Which I thought was just like such a great way of really embodying what it means to be a preventioneer. Yes, I love that too. And then you got me, who's like more literal, right? And that's just like, I've always been like that. So I said, being a preventioneer means advocating for social change and supporting your community in those efforts. Preventioneers address the root causes of sexual violence and focus on the strengths of humanity in order to eliminate it completely. Preventioneers are leaders in their communities and positive role models to youth. To be a preventioneer, you need to have a soft heart and a strong will. Preventioneers are compassionate and determined. Preventioneers are change makers. They hold space for youth to use their power and voice to advocate for healthier communities. Preventioneers foster relationships and connections between young people and adults. They're the people every community needs. So definitely a lot more literal and a very long answer compared to Madison. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Any questions before we move forward? And if you do, especially like as I'm going through the slides, just unmute yourself if you're comfortable and just, interject, because I only look at the chat like in between slides and things like that. And I do not mind at all. This is a casual space, at least I hope it is. I want this to be as a casual, interactive, engaging space as possible. So please, like, there's nothing super formal about any of this. So a benefit of our PE prevention work is that you have access to us, the folks at TASA, as your technical assistance providers. So cool. But what is technical assistance, right? You can think of technical assistance, or TA, as we most often talk about it, as programmatic coaching or even one-on-one support. So all of y'all have a point of contact that you reach out to if you have any TA needs, right? So I might be your point of contact, Madison might be your point of contact, or Melanie. So for example, if you have a question about engaging youth in your community level work, then this is something that we can sort through together. If you have a question about implementing the curricula that you're working with, that's something we can also talk about. There is never any question that's too big or too small for TA, honestly. Like we are your support people. Anything that you need, we are, like your on-demand technical assistance providers, like as needed, right? And there's never any pressure to reach out to us either. But, TA doesn't have to be one-on-one either. Like that's not the only way we can provide TA to y'all. So let's say, for example, of a program who's having a similar challenge as you, or you hear of another program that's doing amazing work that you'd like to get advice from. or you'd like to brainstorm with, right? We can make a group TA session happen. So it doesn't necessarily have to be one-on-one. I know some folks feel nervous about meeting with somebody one-on-one, but we can make it a group thing. It doesn't have to necessarily be like, it's not a one size thing. We can, anything you need, we can make it happen. So like I mentioned, we're your TA providers. And we call ourselves a trio because we work super well together and we check in frequently with one another. If there's ever something that one of us doesn't have an answer to, we reach out to the other for support. We reach out to one another. If you ever want to get a hold of the three of us, or if you want to include Tim and Emiliano in any communications like email or anything like that, you can email us at prevention@tasa.org. Let me drop that in the chat.
Okay, so I have a question.
Yes.
What curriculum do you guys use for prevention in high school?
That's a great question. Anyone using any curricula right now? So we're actually going to be talking more about this later after lunch, but I'd love to hear if anyone's implementing any curricula. Because I know some folks we
use MVP from Jackson Katz. I just wanted to know if there was a different one or an updated one, because sometimes the scenarios could be a little outdated, or maybe they don't relate as much. So just throwing it in there.
Yeah, so Mari says that they're going to start implementing MVP and Live Respect. So if y'all ever wanted to meet together, brainstorm, talk about how you're facilitating those in the school, we can make that happen, but also no pressure. Just, you can either contact each other in this space, let me know, I can set something up. But yeah, so we'll talk about that a little bit more, especially because there's been a shift in programming, and I know it might be a little confusing because it says in your program summary that you're supposed to have at least one curricula that you're implementing, but I think it's also potentially maybe a little misleading, but we'll talk about that this afternoon, so no worries. But thank you so much for asking that question. I hope that I didn't confuse you and you're like, what? But I promise we're going to talk about it. We got your back. Anything you need, literally anything you need, we got you. Need motivation? We got you. Want to share your successes with us? We got you. Need encouragement? We got you. Need to vent? We also got you. Literally anything you need. That's what our TA sessions are for. So utilize it if that's something that you're interested in doing. I'm going to take a sip of water quick. So next, we're going to break down acronyms that we commonly use in this work, which there's a lot of them. Okay, so brace yourself. So feel free to stop me at any point if you have any questions or want any clarification about anything. So first is the CDC. So this is Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The CDC is the entity, the organization, it's like a government entity that really guides the direction of prevention education nationally. So we get our guidance from the CDC, but so does everyone else across the state. I mean, not the state, the nation. Sorry, my bad. Next, we have the OAG, which stands for the Office of the Attorney General. You're going to hear us say OAG a lot because they are our funders. Specifically, y'all have probably already met with Peggy. For those of you who are super, super new, you probably don't know who she is yet. But Peggy is our contact person at the OAG, which the OAG is a state government office, right? So the CDC is national, but the OAG is at the state level. And at some point, you definitely will be meeting with Peggy. She does quarterly TA with all the folks who receive RPE funding, so you will meet her at some point if you haven't already. Next, we have A&M, which you're probably like, what? A&M? Like the university? Yes, A&M, like the university. They have an evaluation team at A&M who is actually our partner. So they also receive RPE funding, but they do all the evaluation side of things. And whereas us at TASA, we do like the programmatic TA support type of stuff. They do all the evaluation side of the grant. Then we have RPE, which is Rape Prevention Education, which is the grant that funds all of our jobs. And this is a federal grant. So folks all across the country also receive this money who are doing RPE work. And then we also have a smaller funding stream that's focused specific to primary prevention approaches. So 18 programs, 18 centers across our state specifically receive RPE funding. So there are folks across the state who are still doing prevention work, but it's not RPE prevention work. So we'll talk about that here, actually. So we have folks who receive SAPCS funding, who's Sexual Assault Prevention and Crisis Services. So this is also a state-funded grant. And these folks do prevention education, which is actually more flexible and more broad with things that they can talk about. Is an education-based approach. So as you know, in our work specifically, where there's been a shift to community level work, but SAPCS folks are focused on doing education. And then we have PP, which I feel like I never really hear people talk about prevention like this, or primary prevention. I feel like people even shorten it even more. So when we talk about prevention, it's not primary prevention, even though that is the scope of our work, we kind of even like shorthand it and we just say prevention. But then we have a PPC, which is a primary prevention coordinator. So that's folks that's y'all, maybe not all of you in this space, but it's folks in the field who are in a manager or supervisor role on your team. They're really the ones that overlook or oversee the work that you're doing in your agency. And then we have the triple PC, which I know can get super confusing because it's like, well, there's a lot of P's and a lot of C's, but this is a primary prevention planning committee. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that is, what they do here in a moment. And then this one's important. We have RF and PF, which stands for risk factor and protective factor. And this is something that's really important to know. And we'll talk about it a little bit later today too. But a risk factor are the factors associated with greater likelihood of violence perpetration. They should not be considered direct causes, but instead as underlying or contributing factors to sexual violence, right? And then a protective factor on the other side of the coin may lessen the likelihood of sexual violence, victimization, or perpetration by buffering against risk. So we have things that put someone at a higher risk of perpetrating violence or being a victim of violence. And then we have things that also protect us from experiencing violence or causing harm, right, to other people. And we'll talk about that here soon too. And then we have something called COP. So these are our online spaces that we host that are called communities of practice. And these are online meetings and trainings as part of our efforts to support the shift in RPE program guidance towards community level work. So like I said, there's been a shift. So historically, RPE the work under RPE has been a lot of education. It's been very educational, right? Where you go into the school and you do a curricula, kind of similar to what some of y'all are still currently doing. But the CDC has released guidance and really emphasizing more of a shift toward community level work. And we'll talk about what that means, what that looks like later today. But that's why we have these communities of practice, so we can really provide that guidance on how you can do that work, right? So these spaces really rotate between formal trainings. So these are structured conversations around potentially common challenges and solutions to those challenges. And we also have more open forums or spaces in which y'all, the attendees, actually guide the agenda. We can say, hey, this is going to be an unstructured COP. Y'all show up, and it's like, you're okay. We're there to support people for y'all, and like, hey, I'm really having this issue, or I really want to learn more about this. I want to brainstorm through this, and it's really open for y'all to guide where the conversation goes. And last but not least, we have ACCs, which stands for the Approach and Curriculum Collective. So once this new guidance came out, the first year that we implemented it was in 2020. And you know what? COVID hit. Like right when there was like this massive shift. We went from focusing on educational sessions to now we're wanting to really mobilize and change the culture of our communities. And then COVID hit. So there was so many barriers, we really wanted to be intentional about how we're brainstorming and really coming together to create spaces for y'all that focuses on your selected approaches, right? Which we'll talk about a little bit later, but whether that's engaging men and boys as allies, if that's what the focus that your agency is focused on, if it's creating leadership opportunities, if it's bystander intervention, right? We wanted a space for y'all, the field, to really lean on each other and exchange ideas or brainstorm through challenges and curiosities with one another. And ACCs, I will say, are field-led, right? So for whoever wants to really facilitate that space, it's like, hey, we're doing MVP and we're meeting with our young people, but we have this challenge, that we're experiencing. Anyone else experiencing a similar challenge? Like that is the space for those types of conversations. Which is why, like Daniela, she approached us, Daniela from the Bridge Over Troubled Waters in Pasadena, which is in the Houston area. She approached us and was like, hey, like, I really love talking about social media. It's really working for our program. Like, I want to help people use Instagram specifically and help them create a story, create reels, because that's how they've been able to get their community engagement, community partners, community actually involved in their programming. So Daniela's social media mini series is considered an ACC, for example. So say what? Let me check the chat really quick. Okay, there's nothing in the chat. So in this section, we're going to talk about the power of language and how it's changed over time and why it's important in the work that we do. So first, it's important to know the difference between intent and impact, right? A lot of times you intend to say what you intend to say, and the impact it actually has on someone, they're just not aligned. So for example, you may have good intentions behind whatever it is you're meaning, but how it's received can be completely different. So it's important to be mindful about what we say and how we say them. So for example, let's say, I feel like this is a really common example, but it's like, let's say you're hanging out with friends or family, because family is going to be honest with you, right? And you're like, oh, you're going to go out or something, and you're like trying on an outfit. You're like, hey, does this look good? Should I wear these pants, for example? And then let's say your mom or your sister or someone is like, actually, that doesn't really look good on you. It's not doing anything for your body, right? Or anything like that. It's like the intention is good, right? Like they want to help you out and let you know what they really think, but how it's received, I mean, that can hurt your feelings, right? So a lot of times it's important for us to think about what we're saying and how it's actually going to be impacting the people we're working with. I know that's not a scenario that would be necessarily that we might experience in our work, but That's just to give you an example of the difference between intent and impact. We also want to be sure that we're using inclusive language. So Juanita from the Friendship of Women actually says this about language. She said, language is always evolving, as are we within culture, which is so true, right? Using inclusive language is super important because it has the power to make someone feel seen and validated. Likewise, right, it also has, if you're using exclusionary language, if you're leaving people out of the conversation, that can also be harmful, right? It has the power to hurt somebody's feelings. So we want to be sure that we're being inclusive and being mindful of the intent and impact that we're having on folks when we're speaking to them, when we're interacting with them. So I want to take a second for a brave space reflection. You can write this down. You can unmute yourself and share with us. But think back to the most recent time when you heard a phrase or a word that you weren't familiar with. How did you figure out the meaning, and where did you go to learn its meaning? I'll give y'all a moment to think about that. Does anyone want to share with us? Okay, we have one chat. Let's see. Folks, asked Melanie when we had our one-on-one. I was confused when I saw it in all our emails and had no idea what it meant. Oh, that is perfect because we're going to talk about what it means and why we use it here soon, before lunch for sure. We're almost there. We're getting to that slide soon. But folks is something that we talk about. I mean, spelling it in that way is something we're super intentional about, and it's on purpose. It's not just because it looks cool or looks different, but we'll talk about that here soon. Anyone else? No pressure either. We'll move on. Oh, we have one.
Hi, Alexis.
Hey.
Just wanted to pop in.
Hey, did you see your quote?
What did she say?
Look.
See the quote? Oh, you can't hear. Sorry, hold on.
Yes.
There.
Oh, I can hear you now.
Yeah, we included one of your quotes in our presentation.
That's
So
what I
sorry.
told her. I
So
was like,
sorry.
look, you made it to the PowerPoint.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Okay, bye. Most of the time I'll just Google it. Yeah, I mean, and you know what? We have the power of the internet at our fingertips for a lot of us, right? For those of us, especially who have smartphones and have access to Wi-Fi and things like that. Like everything now, you can just Google, like a quick Google search, and it'll tells you everything, honestly. But let's go ahead and move on. So these are some common words that we use in our movement, in this field, in our work, right? So Denise, I got you. First, we're going to be talking about folks. So folks, we are very intentional about spelling it in this way. It's an alternative spelling for folks. Got you, Denise. And I love this little GIF over here. Did you say fox in a British accent? If in your mind you kind of want to say it to yourself, I almost said it, but I don't want to embarrass myself. My British accent is not good. So it does kind of sound like fox in a British accent. But anyway, so we use this spelling of folks because it was adopted to indicate the inclusion of communities who are marginalized, specifically for those who are people of color, and for folks who identify as like trans, non-binary, genderqueer, things like that, because the X itself indicates a neutral, it's a gender neutral letter term, and so it includes all identities, right? And then specifically for folks of color and people who could potentially, or people who are trans. And it's important to not take inclusion for granted, right? So I do also see sometimes people in emails or any sort of communication when they're spelling folks like in this way, that's bolded in the first bullet, and I'm just like, oh, because I mean, even though they sound the same, they mean, I was gonna say they mean the same thing, they do, but just knowing that there's an intentionality behind it, I feel like makes all the difference. But we have this quote here. Oh man, it's not popping out. But it's a Twitter quote. There we go. There's nothing inherently exclusive about the word folks, but in certain contexts, it can be useful to use the alternative folks with the X to symbolize inclusion of people of color and trans people. Use your best judgment. So, Denise, not to put you on the spot, but does that answer your question? Do you have any clarifying questions that you want to ask?
Sorry, I'm eating a snack.
Okay.
No, that actually answered my question, because I know I had asked Juanita and she's like, ask Melanie. So I wrote it down on a post-it note, but she went ahead and explained it. But that actually makes sense. I mean, I think she said you can even add it to more than just folks to it as well. I think you can add it somewhere else, the X. But yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. And we'll actually talk about that other word that has the X at the end that's relevant to you and I here in a second too, because that's one of the words that was on our list. But next, we're going to be talking about pronouns. So we didn't talk about pronouns at the start of this session just because, just in case you're new to pronouns and you don't necessarily know what that means or why we use them. But a pronoun are used in place of a proper noun. So like someone's name, for example. We use pronouns most often when referring to someone without using their name, right? So an example of this would be, have you heard from Tom? He hasn't texted me back all day. So he would be the pronoun. And why does it matter? It's most commonly used pronouns are he and she. And they specifically refer to a person's gender. So for queer and gender nonconforming, non-binary, and people who are transgender, these pronouns may not fit and can create discomfort, dysphoria, and can even cause stress and anxiety. So, if you're not sure of somebody's pronouns, you can use they, because it really centers their humanness, right? And we're not wanting to assume somebody's pronoun. And I will say, especially in our movement, pronouns have become so commonplace that a lot of times you see them on people's Zoom screen, right? So for example, mine says she, her, ella, and I'm really intentional about including the ella because I want people to know that I speak Spanish, right? In case somebody's in a space that is not super comfortable speaking English, even though I'm not super fluent. I don't speak it perfect, but I want them to know that they can come to me and I can provide support to them in case they are a Spanish speaking person. So this is a little table of different examples of different pronouns that exist. So there are not just he, she pronouns, right? There are pronouns beyond that that exist. So we want to be mindful of that and respect people's pronouns. So an example of this would be, like introducing yourself with your pronouns. If you're not sure of somebody's pronouns, you can just, open up the space by introducing yourself with your pronouns. So you can say, for me, example, my name is Alexis and I use the pronouns she, her, and ella, right? And something else that you might notice, and even in the emails that you receive from me or anyone at TASA, is that, pronouns are really being included in email signatures now. Doing this is important because it creates inclusion and visibility to those who are part of marginalized communities. So, for example, folks who are non-binary or genderqueer or are transgender, right? It's really important for visibility, for validation, right? And we also want to avoid somebody's gender, right? And even using gendered language. So you can say they are coming over versus he is coming over, especially when you don't know someone's pronouns, right? Let's say you're meeting somebody for the first time, maybe it's a job interview, and you see that the name on the application says Sean, for example, right? I mean, Sean, that could be a female name, that could be a male name, right? So you don't want to already assign a gender to it. So it's like, have they showed up for the interview yet, right? Instead of saying, has he or she shown up for the interview? Because from this table, from this chart, we know that there are other pronouns that exist as well. And something that I did want to mention was that a lot of times you'll hear people ask for preferred pronouns. What are your preferred pronouns? But I will go as far as saying that's problematic. That's problematic because it suggests that if you don't get their pronouns right, that another one is also okay, right? So while there are people who have more than one pronoun. So for example, I've seen recently on Zoom calls where people like in their Zoom name, so like how mine are in parentheses, they'll put like she/they. So that means you can use she, her pronouns with them, or you can use they, them pronouns, and they're fine with either one. So there are people who have more than one pronoun that they're fine using, but there are a lot of people who aren't okay with that. So for example, mine are she, her, ella, and I wouldn't like it if somebody called me he, him, or él, right, in Spanish, even though it has happened to me before, believe it or not, more than once. So that was interesting, and it definitely made me feel some type of way, but so we just want to be respectful and honor people's pronouns. Next, we're going to be talking about LGBTQ+ and why it's important. So LGBTQ+ is an acronym meant to encompass diverse sexualities and gender identities. So while there's no such thing as an LGBTQ+ person, right? Like somebody wouldn't say I'm LGBTQ, like they might say I'm in the LGBTQ community. But these letters, this acronym really encompasses a range of identities, right? So lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, they're all different labels that represent different identities. And importantly, there are words that relate to folks' experiences of gender and sexual identities, which are two things that we often confuse for being one and the same. But somebody's gender identity and their sexual orientation or their sexual identity are two completely different things. LGB, those letters in the acronym, they all represent sexual identities, right? And the T represents a gender identity, and the Q specifically, this one is really interesting because sometimes it's referred to as somebody who's questioning. So either questioning their sexuality or maybe even their gender identity. But queer specifically is often used as an umbrella term, which is used in an affirming and positive way because in the past, queer was a derogatory term, but now it has been reclaimed and is used in a positive way. But the word queer is used to lump all marginalized sexualities and genders under one category. That is a super broad category for sure. So LGBTQ encompasses a spectrum of identities, like I already mentioned. And it's important to know because ideally we want folks who identify as LGBTQ to be a part of our programming, right? We want folks who are from all backgrounds represented in our RPE work, in our community level work. So this includes youth and adults. We want LGBTQ plus folks to be included and for their voices to be heard, because they have very different experiences than people who are not LGBTQ. So we want them to be represented as well. And if you don't know, like if you still have learning to do about the LGBTQ plus community or just queer folks in general, education is the best form of inclusion, right? You don't know something, look it up, right? We were just talking about how we have the internet at our fingertips, how we have Google especially, right? You don't know something, look it up, and you know it's going to help really validate and uplift people. And you don't know, it could potentially even save a life, honestly. Not to be dramatic, but I mean it's that important. So next, we're going to be talking about POC, which we've already talked a little bit about, which stands for people of color, and more specifically BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So POC is an umbrella term that collectively refers to all people of color, which basically means anyone who isn't white, right? So this is a broad descriptor that includes people from India, East Asia, Mexico, Hawaii, and other Pacific Islands, and the Philippines. Basically anyone whose lineage, heritage doesn't come out of Europe, and even then some parts of Europe, right? And then BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And BIPOC is the one, is the concept that has been used especially more recently, because not only is it person first language, but it especially highlights and acknowledges and honors the experiences of Black and Indigenous folks specifically, and the trauma that they have experienced historically. So Black generally describes a person of African or Caribbean descent. Indigenous, as used in the United States, describes the native inhabitants of North America. Indigenous is a broad term encompassing all tribes of the original residents of the continent. So that includes American Indians or Native Americans, First Nations, Native Alaskans, or Alaska Natives. So BIPOC, why does it matter? So like I mentioned, this is a term that is centered in our work. It's something that we use the most because it emphasizes more specifically than the term people of color the following. You know, it really highlights that people of color face varying types of discrimination and prejudice, especially when it comes to our pigmentation or skin tone, right? Folks who have darker skin, they're going to experience more prejudice and discrimination than those who have lighter skin. And systemic racism continues to oppress, invalidate, and deeply affect the lives of Black and Indigenous people in ways that other people of color may not have necessarily had to experience, which, Black and Indigenous individuals and communities, still bear the impact and the trauma of slavery and genocide. So that specifically is the reason why we centered BIPOC. We centered Black and Indigenous identities because of the trauma, the hurt that was caused through slavery and genocide. And the term aims to bring to center stage the specific violence, cultural erasure, and discrimination experienced by Black and Indigenous people. So this reinforces the fact that not all people of color have the same experience, and particularly when it comes to legislation and systemic oppression, right? Black and Indigenous folks carry a lot of the the short end of the stick, I'll say very nicely, when it comes to different being treated differently in the system and in legislation. So next we want to talk about, well, let me pause. Any questions about that? So next we want to be using people first language. So when we default to person first language, that puts the person ahead of their characteristics, right? So like the different identities or descriptors that we have that make up our identities. So for example, instead of saying a blind man or a female engineer, we use a man who is blind or a man who is visually impaired or a woman on our engineering team, right? Because that puts their personhood first before anything else that may be a part of their identity. So people first language keeps the individuals as the most essential element. There is more to each of us than our descriptors, right? So to mention characteristics like gender, sexual orientation, religion, racial group, or ability, is not necessary, and you can mention it only when it, or just be mindful of mentioning it when it's relevant to the discussion, but it's not, something that you should go out of your way to, really mention unless it's relevant. So Denise, the other word that has the X, Latinx. Let's see the chat. Okay, so Latinx is a gender neutral term that emerged around the 2010s. So this is important, especially for those of us who speak Spanish, who know Spanish. We know that the Spanish language is gendered, right? With nouns ending in a for words that are perceived as feminine and nouns ending in o that we think of as masculine. And it's it's been so embraced by our society that it's even in the dictionary. Merriam-Webster has its own dictionary has its own definition of Latinx or Latinx. And it's especially it's been especially embraced by folks who are LGBTQ and also identify within or have Latin American heritage, because it honors and it respects any identities that are outside the male-female binary, right? And especially since we were just talking about folks who are indigenous, there is a gender identity called Two-Spirit, right? So that's folks who have both who identify with masculinity and femininity. So this honors different gender identities of folks who do identify as Latinx. And I will say too that this is a term that you will notice that's getting used more and more, not only within our movement, but in our society as well. I feel like nowadays we're hardly hearing people say Latino or Latina anymore, but there's a caveat too, right? I think this also has to do with access to this kind of knowledge and information, right? So for example, back home where I'm from McAllen, which is in the Valley. It's like 95% Hispanic population. When I'm back home and it's like border town, border area, borders Mexico, I hardly hear people say Latinx, right? And I think that also has something to do with the culture of the community. So where I'm from, it's very machista, right? Like people are really clinging on to the masculine and feminine nouns. And I think So this is something that even though more broadly in our society, it's a term that's been embraced. I also do think, especially within Hispanic or Latinx communities, it's a little more niche. Like it's a little more, it's like a pocket of information that's not widely accepted, I guess, if you will. And if anyone has any pushback on that, if you live in a border town or a community that's primarily Hispanic, Latinx, and if they are embracing it, let me know because I think that's important. I personally have not had that experience yet. I think it's slowly happening. Okay, any questions about this? Okay. Okay, we're gonna take a 10-minute break. Woo! That was a lot. That was a lot. But we'll see you in 10 minutes. Feel free to stretch your legs, drink some water, use the restroom. I'm gonna turn my camera off and we'll see you back at 12:56 Central Time. 11:56. I don't know. I already confused myself with time. I'll see you in 10 minutes.
Mary, I know what I'm going to do tomorrow and the next day and next year and the year after that. I'm shaking the dust of this crummy little town off my feet and I'm going to see the world. What is it you want, Mary? What do you want? You want the moon? Just say the word and I'll throw a lasso around it and pull it down. Hey, that's a pretty good idea. I'll give you the moon, Mary. I'll take it.
Will y'all let me know if you're back in the chat or mute yourself or thumbs up or something? Yeah, we got a few folks back. Thank you for hanging in there with me. We'll get started at 11:56. Oh, it's 11:56. Okay. I hope a few more people will join us here in a second. Got a thumbs up. Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and continue. So next we're going to be talking about the importance of talking about youth by referring to them as young people versus kids, right? Or referring to youth as youth instead of saying, oh, the kids I'm working with, blah, 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 right? It's important to call young people, or to call youth young people, because it creates a structure of empowerment in a shared space, right? And it provides space for authentic intergenerational connectedness instead of, calling someone, oh, the kids that I'm working with, the kids over there, right? Excuse me. Young people need to believe in their own self-worth and to feel that they have control over the things that might happen to them. So calling young people, it really empowers them to have their own autonomy and creates an environment for them to be surrounded by people who love, care, and appreciate and accept them, right? And I think calling youth young people, or even referring to them as youth, is important because it also calls out adultism. And adultism, if you don't know what that is, it's the prejudice against young people in a nutshell, right? Plus, let's say you're working with high school age youth, right? And someone, happens to be like 18 that's in your programming. And if you refer to them, referring to someone as a kid who's 18, that could be a little condescending, right? Because legally they're an adult. But so we just want to make sure that we're uplifting them, empowering them, giving them a sense of autonomy, instead of, calling them kids, which is and can be condescending. Next, we're going to be talking about being an ally, an allyship, right? So an ally is someone who supports a group other than their own. So in terms of racial identity, gender, faith, sexual orientation, and really any other identity. And allies acknowledge the disadvantage and oppression of other groups. They take risks and action on behalf of others and invest in strengthening their own knowledge and awareness of the oppression that exists, right? So allyship is important because it means that the person or group with more social power is supporting and helping to bear some of the weight of the oppressed group, and is actively seeking ways to lighten the load for folks with marginalized identities, right? So like mentioned, it's about expanding knowledge and awareness, but it's also about taking action. So for example, at TASA, we have an Aspiring White Allies Roundtable that's hosted at our conference every year. As of late. So this is something that's still relatively new, and even internally at our organization, we have an Aspiring White Allies group for white folks who are working at TASA to really be a part of. So the objective of this space is to identify and acknowledge the privilege that they have in spaces, whether it be online or in an actual physical space, and how they can use that privilege to support BIPOC folks that they're working with or really wanting to help out, right? So allyship is an action, it's a verb, like it shows in that image there. Any questions about that? So we're gonna do a quick brave space reflection. So what does allyship look like to you? Take a moment to reflect, and you're welcome to share with us if you'd like. Anyone want to share with us? No pressure, but we'd love to hear what you wrote down or what you think allyship is. Go ahead and move on. So equity. Oh, somebody. So Itza asked if allyship is like standing up for what you believe in. So yeah, that's part of it, right? But it's really about using your privilege to help a group that doesn't have as much social power as you. Does that make sense, Itza? Yes, okay, cool. Any other questions or comments or anything about that? So Carolina says, being able to look at ourselves and recognize our biases, what they are, why do we have them, etc., then actively work towards deconstructing them and hopefully eliminating them altogether. Oh, I love this. I love that. Yeah, definitely. So that's part of like the internal work that you do, right? But allyship can also be actions that you take in the community or you take on behalf of folks in different communities as well. But I love that because that is totally what being an ally looks like. Love that. So equity, this is super interesting to me because at first I used to think equity and equality were the same thing, right? I'm like, oh, it's just like a shorter way of saying equality. But actually, they're different. So equity is the fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. So this is, in order to improve this, that involves increasing justice and fairness. I feel like that's a key word, fairness, within our procedures and processes of institutions or systems, as well as their distribution of resources. So essentially what this is really trying to say, or why this is so important, is because different people face different barriers, right? We know that. And equity is about being mindful and making accommodations so that it's fair for everyone and everyone has access to the same opportunities. So on the next slide, before we move on, tackling equity issues requires an understanding of the root causes of outcome disparities within our society, right? So why is it that folks are at a disadvantage, right, in comparison to other folks? But I love this image right here because it really illustrates the difference between equality and equity. Whereas equality is about sameness, right? Equity is really about being fair. I love this image. Once I saw this, I was like, whoa, okay. So like it really helped to put into perspective the difference between the two and why equity is so, so important. Do we have any questions about this? I used to think they meant the same thing. So next we're going to be talking about intersectionality. which is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 in one of her essays. And so I feel like the easiest or most simplest way I could describe intersectionality, well, let's read the definition. So intersectionality is a complex cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially at the experiences of marginalized individuals or groups. So intersectionality is really important, and it's a concept in our field that we talk about a lot. And it's critical to even keep in mind outside of the scope of our work, because essentially intersectionality calls attention to what can be thought of as a progressive stack, which is a term that ALGO, a queer POC organization, a statewide in Texas organization, is a term that they use all the time, progressive stack. And it's really for those who are most negatively impacted in our society. So this definition here says racism, sexism, and classism. So those are just some examples of different identities that we carry that can put us at a more, to the margins, right? So for example, let's say you're a Black, we know Black folks experience a lot of discrimination and oppression. Black woman who happens to be poor, right? So these are all identities that make you more vulnerable, right? Put you in a more vulnerable position. And this is just a concept that's super important to keep in mind when you're working with young people, when you're working with adults in your communities, because not everyone has the same experiences, right? Their identities and all the different things that they carry really affects how somebody moves in the world and how they're going to show up to spaces. So Kimberly Crenshaw says, if we are intersectional, some of us, specifically the most vulnerable, are going to fall through the cracks. So again, keeping in mind folks who are the most vulnerable in our communities, because we don't want to leave them behind, right? We want to make sure that we're giving them access, and we're providing resources and support, especially for folks who are the most vulnerable in our communities. Well, I guess, should we continue on? Let's do a vote. We can talk for another 20 minutes, or we can pause for lunch, but either way, we're going to come back at 1:30. Let's do a vote. I'm going to pause this recording. We got some folks who are back. I hope y'all had a good lunch. What did y'all have for lunch? Anyone want to share? No pressure. Had this there's this place that I get my lunches from recently. Oh, hamburger from where? Edward, that sounds so good. There's this place called Snack Kitchen, and they have like prepped meals that you can buy. And today I had like some quinoa. It's a quinoa rice, beans, and I don't know what else is in it. It's kind of spicy. Oh, PB&J, that is a guilty pleasure. I love me a good PB&J. Have you ever had it with like toasted with toast? Oh, that's so good. And then some banana in there too. Ramen and sandwich. Yum. I had ramen like 2 nights ago. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Sushi, yum. I'm actually not super big into sushi, but everyone around me loves sushi. So I give it a chance every now and then. And it just has to be like the right roll, you know? Okay, let's go ahead and get started. hope everyone had a great lunch and that you had a great break and you had some time to relax, decompress, take care of yourself. But before we get started, do we have any questions, curiosities, anything you want clarification around from the first half of our time together? Okay. Well, we have one more person joining us. Let's see the chat. Okay. So I'm glad that you were able to make it back. And actually, so this second half of our time together is actually going to be like the most important part of the training. So we're actually going to be talking about like doing a deeper dive into RPE, into community level work, into, you know, the history of prevention and why we're at where we're at, and really what that's going to look like moving forward. And, you know, any questions y'all have, feel free to just ask away. But we are going to go on an adventure for this next section, okay? Just bear with me. And some of y'all might have heard of this story. So in this field, we talk about prevention by using a river analogy, right? So we're going to go on a journey along the river. So imagine for a second that you're out floating on the river with your friends and family on a summer day. So for me, I'm floating on the San Marcos River only because I lived there for 7 years. But imagine your favorite river. It could be in Texas, it could be anywhere in the world. But you're out enjoying the water, the company also, when all of a sudden you see somebody drowning in the water. You jump out of your tube and you swim against the current to help them out. Thankfully, you were able to help them and you head back to your tube. When all of a sudden you see another person drowning, and then another person drowning, and then another, what do you do in that situation? How can you help them all when you're swimming against the current? Does anyone have any ideas of what you can do in that situation? Telling more people to help. Yes, that's a good idea. Anyone else? So this is a pretty common analogy that we use in prevention. So a lot of you might have already heard this story. Let's see what else we got in the chat. Go find the bridge. Tell them to put on life vests. Yeah, so these are all some good ways that we can really help people out, right? Where people are being pushed or jumping. Yeah, so definitely, Tracy, I think you're getting to the heart of what I'm trying to convey. So actually, Gloria Steinem says, we're still standing on the bank of the river, right? We're still standing alongside the river, rescuing people who are drowning. We have not gone to the head of the river to keep them from falling in. So that's really what Tracy was mentioning, that we need to get to the root of the problem, right? We need to prevent them from even falling into the river in the first place. So this brings us to the levels of prevention. You may be thinking, what? There's levels? Because that's what I thought when I first started in prevention. But yes, there are levels to this. So our focus and our job is primary prevention. And that is working to end sexual violence before it even happens. So the first level of prevention is primary, which is where we live, where we work, right? So this takes place before violence has occurred. The goal is to prevent first-time perpetration or victimization by eliminating risk factors that increase the likelihood of perpetration and building on protective factors that reduce sexual violence perpetration and victimization. So, all right, there's a lot in there. We are going to be talking about risk factors and protective factors. We did mention it at the beginning or the first half of our time together, but no worries. We're going to talk more about what that actually means. So primary prevention, we want to prevent it before it even happens. Secondary prevention involves implementing prevention efforts with people who have already experienced or perpetuated some sort of violence. So really, in this second level, in secondary prevention, that's when somebody's intervening right after the violence has happened, right? So this includes services such as hospital accompaniment or crisis intervention, awareness, and outreach initiatives. And lastly, we have tertiary. So that's the third level of prevention, which involves more long-term responses after sexual violence has occurred to deal with the lasting consequences of violence. So this includes things like sex offender treatment and long-term counseling or therapy, or even long-term social service support. Right, so both secondary and tertiary is some sort of intervention that happens after violence has already occurred, but we're trying to stop it before it even happens. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about risk reduction and how it's different from primary prevention. This is important because a lot of folks confuse risk reduction for primary prevention. So an example of risk reduction would be like telling people to watch their drinks when they're out at a bar, right? So risk reduction puts the burden on the individual so that they are in situations where they can be victimized. Whereas primary prevention really gets to the root of the issue and works to prevent it from happening in the first place. So if we're going to continue to use that bar example, a primary prevention approach would push for all men, we're just going to use men for this instance, to respect women in the space, so it doesn't even have to get to the point where people in the bar are monitoring their drinks or even having to worry about how they're dressed if they're out at a bar, right? And I'm only using men as a person causing harm in this scenario because we know that men disproportionately are the people who are causing harm or perpetuating violence. So do y'all understand the difference between risk reduction and primary prevention based off that example? Okay, awesome. Yes. Perfect. This is good to know because a lot of times people think, risk reduction is primary prevention, but that's not actually true. So let's take a deeper dive into what all this actually means and where we fit into all of this. Okay, awesome. So let's imagine we're talking about a plant and we're trying to solve the problem of sexual violence. Let's think about the problem of sexual violence as the bud or the leaf. So if you look here at this image, you can see that, the leaf is the problem, right, that we're trying to get rid of, which is sexual violence. Risk reduction represents the stem. Using a risk reduction approach, if we use a risk reduction approach, yes, we can cut off the problem, right? We can trim the problem, we can cut the leaves off, but it's going to keep coming back because we haven't gotten to the root. Primary prevention is the root in this situation, in this scenario. We need to uplift the issue from the root so that it's eliminated completely with no chance of it growing again. And so in this case, risk reduction allows the roots of the problem to still exist, perpetuating the violence to keep happening, and just hopes to lower the risk that this one person won't be victimized, right? That's what we were just talking about. Risk reduction puts the burden on the person to, hey, you're going to go out, you're going to, you're going to be in a, or, basically telling somebody that you could potentially be putting yourself in a situation that isn't completely safe. And it really puts the burden on that person to take care of themselves. Intervention hopes to interrupt the violence that is already happening, right? So intervention is when you're intervening after the violence happens, but primary prevention hopes to eliminate risk factors and prevent violence before it has ever had the opportunity to happen. So again, just repeating, right? Just really want to drive this in silent. Primary prevention, seeks to get to the root of the issue before it even happens. And we are going to talk about risk factors here, actually, and then we'll move on to protective factors. But how do we get to the source? So let's imagine a new plant, right? It looks similar to the other one, but the parts are different. Risk factors. Well, let's look at the risk factors that grow sexual violence. Risk factors are circumstances or conditions that are conducive to violence. Like the other plant, we want to examine what's at the root, right? So in this case, risk factors for sexual violence would be hypermasculinity, which includes objectification of women and male entitlement, hostility towards women, unhealthy attitudes about sex and sexuality, and also issues around consent and gender inequality. So in this case, these are the root of violence. These are attitudes and behaviors that are prominent that we see in our society through pop culture, in media, social media, and really exists in our communities. So essentially, we are a society we tolerate violence, and we see it all the time that we essentially have become desensitized to these forms of violence, and we as a whole, we pretty much accept it. Any questions about risk factors and what that means? So, what can we do to keep going? How can we move forward, right? We can build on protective factors, which are circumstances and conditions that are conducive to healthy relationships and communities. And this is what we really want to focus on in our community level work moving forward. We know that environments breed violence, but we want to promote qualities that create environments of connectedness, which are our protective factors. Connection to a caring adult, emotional health and connectedness, empathy and concern for how one's actions affect others, and community support and connectedness, right? So if you notice, there's a lot of connectedness, connection, empathy, emotional health. And if we focus on this when we're doing our work, when we're working in communities, then we're really taking a strengths-based approach, and we're building on healthy attitudes and behaviors, right? This is what we're really wanting to promote in our communities versus taking the approach of, this is what we don't want to see, and really dwelling on that aspect, even though it's super, super important to know and to mention and to be mindful of. This is where we really want to be centering our focus and our attention, and should be part of your work moving forward with keeping this in mind. Definitely. So now that we've addressed how risk reduction is different from primary prevention and how they can sometimes be confused, we know that the key points to prevention are preventing sexual violence before it happens. We want to include our population and our community so we can find solutions to end sexual violence. And the goal is to address and build on protective factors as opposed to focusing on sexual violence itself. Because after all, sexual violence is a symptom of these attitudes and behaviors, right? We really want to get to the heart of the issue. Do we have any questions as of now? Is this making sense? So Madison made that fun. I think it's super cute with the DQ song. So now we're going to be looking at the history of prevention in Texas specifically and how we got to where we're currently at now. So how we got here. In 2007, the Triple PC, which in case you forgot, that stands for Primary Prevention Planning Committee, it's the first time that they met. And then in 2010 is the first time that they came up with the state prevention plan. So essentially the Triple PC created a prevention plan based off of the recommendations that they gave to the Office of the Attorney General. So the Triple PC are folks, or at this time in 2007, it was folks in the field, so people like y'all who were interested in really having a seat at the table and being instrumental into navigating how they wanted prevention to look in Texas. So I know Melanie was a part of that process. And I think that's the only person there's a couple other people, but I know she definitely was a part of that. It's somebody from TASA. So right now it's currently Tim, Peggy from the OAG, from the Office of the Attorney General, and someone from the State Department of Health Services. So it's really all those entities working together to really come up with a state plan for what prevention is going to look like in Texas moving forward. So then in 2013, the TASA developed and programs pilot first curricula. So they created, if you look at the line below, the plan amendment, which is really the guidance for our PE programming at that time, which was very much education based, very much going into the schools and doing educational sessions with young people. And the curriculum they created was called Break the Box, which at the time, especially for Texas, was super progressive. Very much about challenging gender norms and things like that. But, you know, potentially at that time could have been a little too progressive. So they advised that TASA go ahead and come up with a new curricula or make some tweaks and gave feedback. And TASA ended up creating building healthy relationships and communities, which is another educational curricula where you go into, it's divided into two phases, where the first phase, you are in the school, you're doing education sessions with young people. And then phase two, there's some sort of activity or some sort of like community level involvement at that point. But in 2020, we got guidance from the CDC, so the Center of Disease Control, that told us, or just across the nation, that they were wanting to really emphasize their focus on the community level. And let me explain a little bit more about what I mean. Explain a little bit more to you about what I mean. So this is the ecological model, which shows us the levels in which we're aiming to impact. So as I was mentioning, those educational sessions, really those are impacting the individual and relationship level, right? We're influencing individuals' attitudes and behaviors and their beliefs, and and they might be sharing that with their friends, with their family, with with people, with adults that might be in their lives, teachers, things like that, right? So all this time, really, we have been focusing on the individual and relationship level, which is, those education sessions. It's just very traditional in that sense. But there's been a push to community level work. So we're moving up a rung from the CDC. And this is a trend that we are going to continue to see moving forward. We're moving away from those traditional educational type sessions and really wanting to impact our communities through social norms change, through relationship building, through really wanting to change the culture of our communities, so that they're more healthy and that they're more connected. So on a broader scale, this is what the CDC has identified as being protective factors for sexual violence. That's gender equality, connectedness, conflict resolution, and empathy. So can anyone remind us of what a protective factor is? Anyone? Well, in case you forgot, I'll remind you. So, oh, we got some. Healthy connection to a caring adult, emotional health, empathy, community support. Yeah, so those are some of the protective factors that we have identified in Texas. But a protective factor, like more broadly, are the conditions that are conducive to creating, or for creating healthy communities, right? So that we, instead of putting us at risk, it's protecting us as a community, right? So that's basically like an initiative. Okay. But yes, that is right. So this is the updated approach for Texas at the community level. Remember, we're wanting to focus and build upon protective factors. So while it's good to know why we have an issue with sexual violence in our communities, we're working to build up on protective factors. So the risk factors in Texas are general aggressiveness and acceptance of violence, general tolerance of sexual violence within community, and societal norms that support sexual violence. So if you remember, we were talking about hypermasculinity, we're talking about objectifying women and tolerating violence, right? More on a broader scale, like this is pretty much encompassing those things, right? So those risk factors don't drastically change from like a national level to our state level. And the protective factors that Tracy mentioned are connection to a caring adult, emotional health and connectedness, empathy and concern for how one's actions affect others, and community support and connectedness. So we're really wanting to build upon creating connection, connectedness in our communities, building empathy, building on emotional intelligence, because the more connected we are, the more likely we're going to care about how our actions are affecting other people. And again, this takes a strengths-based approach. So doing community level work requires us to also engage folks at the relationship level. So even though I said we're moving away from that individual and relationship level, like there is still a little bit of overlap in that relationship level, because relationship building is actually super important in doing community level work. We'll talk a little bit more about this soon. So the goal of doing community level work is to build capacity for folks in our communities. We want to engage community members to take action that positively impacts groups. We want to positively impact social norms and potentially even policies, like local government, things like that. We can tap into this by engaging leadership skills, learn how to handle conflict resolution, and how to create social norms campaigns in our communities. So this is really the heart of community level, right? So we're really wanting to impact the culture of our communities so that they're more positive, instead of it impacting one individual person, and then hopefully they'll share it with somebody else, or we're really wanting to target community members more broadly. So this slide, this is really the bread and butter of your community level work. So in the first half of our time together, I told you that A&M was our partner. We partnered with A&M. Y'all remember that? Well, they did research that they called an alignment study and identified 3 approaches from CDC guidance that were focused that we are going to be focusing on in Texas. And everything is evidence-based, everything is heavily researched. So there's no, there's like, it wasn't just made up, right? It's really, really, it was researched in depth. So these approaches that A&M has selected for us are bystander approaches, right? Or bystander intervention, mobilizing men and boys as allies, and strengthening leadership and opportunities for girls. So if you notice, I was naming the bullet points from that middle column. If you take a look at the column to the far right, you'll see that those first 2 rows, or the first row and the last row, say community, right? That they are associated with the community level. And that middle row, because they have also identified social emotional learning as something that we can do, an approach that we can take in Texas, but that focuses on that individual level, which, like I mentioned, is something that we're really wanting to move away from. So while some of y'all might be have social emotional learning as an approach in your programming, I'm sure potentially at some point you have heard that if you are really implementing that you're going to have to build upon that and still utilize or still focus your work around bystander intervention, engaging men and boys as allies, or strengthening leadership and opportunities for girls, which essentially means that you're doing double work. So it's really up to you to decide how you want to move forward, because we know social emotional learning is still so valuable for our communities. So these approaches is what your work is really centered around, right? It's really what it's focused around. We've started calling it approach-centered community level work because we don't want to lose sight of a goal, right? So let's say your approach is bystander intervention, right? Which, by the way, since I know a lot of y'all are relatively new, your agency selected which approach they felt was best for your communities. And it wasn't just a willy-nilly decision. There was some data collection, some community assessment that went behind making that decision. So, I guess it was, you inherited that approach, and that's really what your community level work needs to be centered and focused around. So while the emphasis is community level work, there are still also curricula that were selected that also align with these topics. So earlier we had Itza ask, if somebody was using MVP because her program is using that, or her agency is using that for their programming. Then we heard that folks at the Purple Door are wanting to implement MVP and Live Respect. So we know that people are still doing in-person education sessions with young people. But I also want to be super clear, and I just want y'all to know that if you are doing that, that's awesome, that's okay. But you just need to know that that part of your work cannot be more than 50% of what you're doing under this grant. Because there really, truly has been just such a push for that community level work. At minimum, 50% of your work needs to be impacting your community in some way, right? Focusing really on that community level work, community mobilizing. But if, 75% or 100% of your work is really focused on mobilizing your communities, I mean, hey, that's allowable. That's even better. That's actually the direction that we are moving in. But if you are still wanting to do education with young people in schools, just know that it can't be more than half of the work that you're doing under this grant, or half of your time that you spend under this grant. Does this make sense? Do y'all have questions about this? Because this is truly super, super important.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
We'll put my camera on real quick. Okay, so I am the P&E manager for the Purple Door. And so this is why I came onto this, so I can learn this kind of stuff. So you said 50% has to be the education pieces and 50% mobilizing. So mobilizing, is that when you say mobilization, when I think mobilization, I'm thinking going out to the communities and just talking to adult influencers, not necessarily doing a training piece, but just having meetings with them. Is that what you are talking about? Or is it, I guess I'm confused to what my version of mobilization is versus what the grants version of mobilization is.
Okay, so yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Thank you so much for asking that. And also, just to be clear, so not necessarily that 50% of your work has to be education, but if you are implementing curricula, it cannot exceed 50% of your time under the grant. Does that make sense? Because we have, for example, like an agency in Pasadena, the Bridge Over Troubled Waters, who's not doing any curricula. Actually, a lot of our grantees are moving away from curricula altogether and are just focusing on that community level work. So when I say community mobilizing, I almost interchange community mobilizing with community level work because you can think of them in the same way. And yeah, so community level work, community mobilizing can be thought of as, yes, going out in the community and making connections with adults, but we don't only want to exclude it specifically to adults because, you know, our communities are filled with young people. There's youth that are really involved in their communities, right? So we really want to engage youth in that process. We really want them to be equal partners with adults in that community level work, in that community mobilizing. So that can look like having meetings and really centered around these approaches, right? Mari, do you know what approaches your agency is specifically working around?
I know right now, because so many of my team that's funded under this grant is new. Right now, we're a lot, honestly, is in that planning process of what this grant is going to look like. Because I would say, I think we have 2 under this grant, and one of them just started, and the other one has only been with us for a few months. Okay. So we're still just planning. My idea, I believe it's, you know, just going into the schools, into the universities, into the middle schools, and not necessarily doing curriculum, but maybe doing one-time type presentations every so often, or going in and doing weekly presentations with the group, but not necessarily a curriculum, just talking to the group.
Okay, yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. And actually, you mentioned something that that is important for me to mention too. So if you are working with college age or university age students, that technically under this grant, under the this guidance, that is considered doing community level work. It's not necessarily considered education sessions, but that is really engaged, really doing that community level work. So for example, I know Alex is on this call and Darcy, they are currently working with college age youth, adults, and they are doing education sessions, but because they are working specifically on college campuses, and whether that's virtual or in person, that under this grant is considered community level work. So I guess that is like a loophole where you can be doing education sessions, but it's still considered community level work. But if you were to be doing education sessions with high school, middle school, elementary, so while you can be doing that, not more than half of your work can exceed, or that can't be more than half of what you're doing, right? You still have to go out into the community and really build those relationships, talk with adults, maybe even businesses, or, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but maybe let's say your approach, actually, I think, Mari, in the past, y'all's agency specifically was working around strengthening leadership opportunities for girls and engaging men and boys as allies. Could be also bystander intervention. You could, I think maybe y'all were doing all three, but I know for sure at least those two. So let's say, for example, you go out into your community and you want to focus on strengthening leadership opportunities for girls, right? You can find different organizations or different businesses to really partner up with who have the same vision, who have the same goal, right? So for example, let's say you really wanted to work with the Girl Scouts, right? Maybe the Girl Scouts is not a right fit for you, but you know, really wanting to build capacity for creating those leadership opportunities for girls. Does that make sense?
Yes, and in fact, me and one of my educators who's that's 100% under the grant. We had just been talking about talking to the Girl Scouts, and Nora, another one of my educators, just put in the chat, the Islander Feminists. Yes, we had spoken to them before as well, and we were looking at going back and trying to meet with the Islander Feminists as well. Okay.
Yeah, so all of that would be considered doing that community level work, whether you're having meetings, and it doesn't all have to be in person, right? Especially since we're experiencing this surge with COVID. COVID is like back on the rise, and things are going to go back to being virtual, so we have to get creative in how we're doing building these relationships and doing community level work even virtually, right? So do we have any other comments, questions, anything about this? Like, I feel my personal opinion is that this slide is probably like the most important of everything we're going to be talking about today. Is anyone feeling nervous because you're like, oh, I'm doing a curricula and like I didn't really know that we had to be out in the community or anything like that? Well, that's good. And also, if at any point questions come up for you, you want to brainstorm, think through things, like reach out to us, right? You can reach out to me, Madison, or Melanie, or you can reach out to the three of us, honestly, and we will help you out. We're your support people. So the goal is for the community to really take ownership of this project, or to really take ownership of your programming and steer your programming in a way that's needed and changes the culture of your communities, right? So you can really even think of yourselves as the liaison, or really the bridge that's helping to make these connections between youth and adults, between your agency and businesses or organizations that exist in your community, right? So you're really helping to get people connected, but you really want your community to take ownership of this project. You don't want to be like, and it's hard, right? Because you're the one who is getting funded. Like, this is your job. So it makes sense if you would want to really lead this initiative. But we really want to practice taking a step back and really, like, your community knows what they need. So we really want them to really step into this leadership role and really make this what they want it to be. So for example, Lubbock, so Voice of Hope in Lubbock, an example of even building on those protective factors, right? Connectedness and connection to a caring adult and things like that. So the center in Lubbock, Voice of Hope, they have a community garden. And in that community garden, they have youth, they have adults. And in that garden, just being around one another helps them to really build those connections with one another. And I know that is like thriving. And we've heard from the Office of the Attorney General that they really love that project that they have going on. But the community is really taking the lead on that. So for example, still going off of that agency, like I've heard that the community wants to make a YouTube channel. They want to make a YouTube channel and cook with the ingredients that they have grown in the garden, right? So not sure if that's actually even happening yet, but that's a way that they are building on those protective factors, and it's really getting momentum, right? And it's really impacting the people that live in that community because they're connecting with one another. I know, like, the folks in Pasadena, which is in the Houston area at the Bridge Over Troubled Waters, they recently had maybe not too recent, maybe about a year ago, they had a pop-up market where their approach area is creating leadership and opportunities for girls. So they had a pop-up market where they had female vendors and it ranged from all age ranges. They had, I think the youngest vendor they had was like 6 years old who had a lemonade stand. I'm like, how cool is that? That gives me chills because it just goes to show that, you know, we're not limited in age, and like, you know, create, really wanting to build capacity and create those leadership opportunities. So we had somebody selling lemonade there, they had somebody selling jewelry, they had performers even at that venue. What else? People selling cookies or like baked goods and things like that. So like that is an example of that community level work, because that one event, you know, people hear about it, word of mouth, they want to go support, right? So those are some examples of things that we've heard about that are happening in the community. Something else, so our folks in Brownsville at the Friendship of Women, they actually even had a summer camp, like a virtual summer camp, or Denise, I'm not sure if that's what y'all were calling it, but we're really the youth are the ones that planned this camp, where they had people come in, they had speakers, and it was virtual, so they invited members of their community. Denise, do you want to talk a little bit about that, where you I want to make sure that I'm like giving it justice or saying it right. If you're there, if you can. If not, no worries. But so they did have like it was essentially a virtual conference, right? Like a 1-day virtual conference. And those young people have actually, they want to get to know TASA more. So they reached out to us directly, and we're actually contracting now with those young people and consulting with them, and they're getting involved in some of the work that we're doing, and we're paying them. And, you know, so that's really what we want when we talk about this community level work, where we give youth agency to really have a true voice and a true, be a part of the decision-making process is what I'm trying to say. Does anyone want to share what y'all's agencies have been doing? Any ideas that you have? There's no pressure, or anything that you've heard that anyone else is doing that you really like, or you're not really sure, like do you need more examples of community level work? Let me know where we at. Temperature check. Alrighty then. Okay, we're gonna keep on moving on. Oh, we got something in the chat. Not sure if you mentioned it, but I know we have classes with juniors and seniors. Okay, do you want to expand a little bit about that? Like, what exactly are y'all doing with juniors and seniors?
I'll just unmute myself because it's a lot to type.
Yeah.
But basically, I mean, I'm pretty sure that's what you mean, right? By like community, like involvement and stuff, what we're doing. So, and I'll go ahead and I'll turn on my camera. So what we do is we have classes and stuff, I guess, kind of meeting times with our juniors and our seniors from a specific class. And so, or from a specific school. And so, yes, we give them volunteer hours, but we actually go ahead and we ask them, like, what do you want to learn? Like in the very beginning, like, what are some topics that you want to talk about? I know we've had like power and privilege. I know when I started about 2 months ago, I've only been like 3 or 4 sessions. We talked about like power and privilege. We talked about gender norms. We talked about, I think it's like gender and social media and stuff like that, because it was something that they wanted to talk about and they wanted to elaborate in, and they kind of wanted to go through it. And so it's just something that we talked about with them because we knew that's what they were going to get their attention on because they already wanted to do it. And so with all that, we also give them volunteer hours, just so that they can, like, we're not only just giving them all this information and they're just not coming to learn here, at least they get something out of it as well. So we actually would give them volunteer hours. That way they can go ahead and be part of this. And I feel like it's a good incentive. And we always do like little events for them. Like, I know me and Juanita were working on a doodling doodling one, but we kind of had to cancel it or push back because of COVID, right? But we're thinking about like self-care type of things that we can do for them and buying them little gifts and things like that. But something to kind of just keep that connection going, but also teach them about what they wanted to learn in the first place. Okay, I'm done.
No, yeah, and that's exactly what I'm talking about, right? It's like really giving them the autonomy, really giving them the power to talk about what they want to do. And I love how y'all are doing that. That was such a great example because I didn't know that y'all were doing that. But does that help, to really understand what we're talking about when we meet that community level work? And Nora, I see your comment. These are great examples. Thanks for sharing. Let me read your comment, Nora. It says, Audrey and I actually worked with college graphic design students who created artwork inspired by harmful masculine norms. We did a whole discussion about what it means and how it affects our work. And they each created a poster and brochures. It was amazing. And I cried at the reception. I mean, that sounds super powerful. So these are different examples of what community level work can look like. And really your options are like limitless. Like you can do whatever it is that your community wants to do, right? You can create any sort of activities. You can have those times when you're meeting with groups of people and not necessarily doing the curricula, but just having conversation, right? Like, and that is you impacting your community. Those are examples of community level work. Any other examples that y'all have? Anything else you've heard about? Questions? Anything? Okay. So our hope is that the community gets so invested in your programming. They're so involved that like they just really are for the mission. That if you decide to move on, let's say, hey, I have a new job opportunity somewhere else and you decide to leave your agency, that this work is going to continue no matter what, right? Whether you're there or not necessarily. Like what I'm trying to say is that like you're not necessarily needed in this programming, in this project, right? However you want to frame it. That is the goal. Like I said, we don't want like, yes, you're the one getting funded. Yes, you're the one who has like certain guidelines that you need to follow, but we want the community to be so invested, so involved that they really take it on, and it's something that really creates a life of its own and that continues on. Let's say for whatever reason, I don't see this happening anytime even remotely soon, but let's say our PE funding were to come to a stop, right? Nobody across the nation receives our PE funding. You know that this initiative is still this project, this programming is still going to live on, right? Like that's an extreme example. That's not going to happen, but like that's just to make a point, right? That it really is supposed to be community led, and we want it to be sustainable too. So any questions? I feel like that was a lot. Will y'all let me know in the chat if this is actually making sense? Because if it's not, that's okay. But I want to know because we want to set you up for success. Makes sense. Good. Awesome. Okay. So let's go ahead and take another little break if y'all want. I feel like that was a lot. We can take a 15-minute break, or we can keep powering on. I feel like there's not too much content that I have left. I mean, there's still quite a bit, or not like a lot. Awesome. Should we power through? Y'all need a break? I'm fine either way. Break. All right, let's take a 15-minute break, and I will see y'all at 2:36. See you at 2:36. Hope everyone had a good break. A little breather. Stretch your legs. Drink some water. Are folks back? I know a couple people had to leave just because they have other meetings and stuff that they needed to get to, which is totally fine. I do plan on sending you all these slides, potentially the video of the recording, in case you miss any part of this training presentation. Got one back, two backs. Let's go ahead and just continue moving forward. Joining us. Three backs. Okay. Thank y'all so much for just like hanging in there. Let's move on. So the core components of community level work can be thought of as the keys to doing community level work. So how can we mobilize our community in a way where we're making authentic connections and leaving a positive impact in our communities, right? So we talked about some examples of folks, some folks at different agencies across the state and like what they're doing. But this is pretty much like the how-to or how you can go about doing that community level work. So first of all, you have to know your community, right? So this includes even virtual spaces, right? Especially because COVID's on the rise again, things are going to start to become more virtual. And this is going to be an active and ongoing process in order to identify community dynamics and even the readiness. Are the folks in your community ready to talk about creating leadership opportunities for girls? Are they wanting to talk about engaging men and boys as allies or bystander intervention initiatives, right? So knowing your community is something that you're always going to be coming back to and assessing at different levels of your community level work. Next, you want to cultivate relationships, right? I feel like we've been talking a lot about really building on those relationships with people in your community, whether it's adults, whether it's young people. You want to make sure that the relationships that you're cultivating are inclusive, that they're mutually respectful, and that your relationships have intentionality behind them. You don't want to just create a relationship with someone or really even bring them into your programming because you're like, oh, yes, that's another number for like our community members and community engagement. You want to make sure that you're really being mindful, inclusive, respectful, and intentional about who you decide to partner with and who the folks that really represent the people that live in your community. Right? We want this to be youth guided. This is something that we've talked about before. We want to be able to promote those opportunities for youth to inform, plan, and lead this community level work. We really want to empower them and build their capacity to be leaders in our communities. We want to foster a supportive environment. So this means encourage spaces for conversations that value all voices and enhance an individual's ability to affect positive change, right? So we want the folks that are involved in our community level programming and our work to come from all backgrounds, right? We really want them to be representative of our communities, like I mentioned. We also want to foster that cross collaboration. So like I was mentioning earlier, you really want to work with folks who have the same goal, who have the same vision, right? You don't want to reinvent the wheel. That's really, if you're working smarter and not harder, you want to partner with, like we mentioned before, potentially the Girl Scouts, if that feels like a good fit. Potentially working with if your approach is engaging men and boys as allies, maybe working with sports or with like a coach or something that maybe is even potentially outside of the school. You know, we have like these I don't even know what they're called. I'm not going to pretend like I know, but you know, like when you enroll young people into sports and it's not like through the school, it's through like the Boys and Girls Club or the YMCA or something like that. Like we want to meet youth where they're at, right? And if that means meeting them at an after school program or something like that, then we really want to take advantage of that and really find folks that we really want to be working with so that we can push the vision forward. And community level work is going to require us taking some action, right? But we also need to know their readiness, right? Are they ready to take action? And we can think of these core components as a dance, right? Like you're going to be moving from this bullet to this bullet and then back up. And, you know, so really all of these things can be happening and moving at the same time. So you need to be able to pivot, be adjustable, and really be okay with potentially even not really, like I said, not being in complete control of your community level work, since we do want it to be community led, community driven. We want them to take ownership of this. You're really a support person in different community spaces to really help just move the vision forward. But, you know, all these things can be happening potentially at the same time. And yep, like I just said, that ownership and leadership. So we can enhance and strengthen leadership and sustainability, but doing it in a way where we can highlight, enhance, respect, and celebrate the progress. I think that's something that's really important, is just acknowledging how far you've come, where you started, even, you know, the planning process, like that's worth celebrating, because I mean, you're further than you were at the very beginning, right? So there's a little more. So here are some quick tools, tips, and tricks to help you really get your community level work off the ground, and what you can use moving forward. So like this gift says, you want to be creative. So there has been, or when this grant was first in effect, is like I mentioned earlier this morning, that's when COVID hit, right? So not only were we, you know, learning about how to do community level work, but we had to be creative. We had to pivot big time and had to really get creative with how we can reach community members. How can we engage folks in the community in a virtual setting? So a lot of folks, you know, have really utilized social media in order to do this. So I know Instagram has been huge. Daniela is even doing the whole social media series on Instagram itself, and how they were able to get engagement from their community just on Instagram alone. I know they have a solid, maybe like 5 members, and they got them all through Instagram. How to use TikTok, right? Or be creative by creating a TikTok. I know the folks in Waco, the Advocacy Center in Waco, like they really use TikTok. Facebook, we know some folks are going live on Facebook. I was actually interviewed by Sean at Darcy, which is the Dallas Area Rape Crisis Center. We went live on Facebook, and he interviewed me about social media, the power of social media in programming. And then Twitter, there's ways you can get creative on Twitter too. Any questions about this? So I don't know how to lower the volume on this, so I'm gonna pause it for. Okay. We're just gonna power through. Okay. So this is an idea that you can even do with your young people, with your community members. You can do a grounding activity. right? Where you play relaxing music and you ask them to take a deep breath and come up with an image, right? And if you want to do it now, I welcome you to do that. Take a couple deep breaths. Sorry. Once that music starts, the lyrics start, I get super distracted. But let me go back really quick just so you can see there is even chair yoga that you can have folks do, right? Just to really welcome them into this space, right? Seated cat-cow, seated forward fold, chest expansion, pigeon, final twist, right? So these are some really creative ways that you can get community members really excited about showing up and really wanting to work with you. So you can even have your young people, your folks, whoever's in your programming, get creative with memes. I know memes are so popular right now. This is an example of one that somebody created. This is Prevention Years at Work now. If you recognize the dinosaur, that's definitely P-Rex. P-Rex isn't always a little animation that we showed. It's just any T-Rex in a prevention space. That is P-Rex. So I thought this was cute. Just an engaging, fun way to get either young people, adults really excited about your programming. So who's driving this thing? Like we've been talking about, we want your program to be guided by youth and adults in your community, right? So don't be afraid to take time to build those relationships, to really take a back seat and to really let them lead this work in the way that they feel like your community needs and in ways that are going to be really resonant for people in your community. That is a great idea. So be who you needed when you were younger. So as you make way in your community level work, remember to be kind and compassionate to yourself and to your community members or partners, right? We want to take an approach that's compassionate, that's understanding, and also being mindful to be patient, because community level work is very slow. So just being patient, being kind with yourself, and be who you needed when you were younger. So working with your community means that you're going to be accountable to them, which is really, really important, right? So take time to self-reflect so that you are mindful and intentional about your collaborations, right? You want to work with somebody who has the same goals, who wants to accomplish the same things, who wants to see positive change in your communities, right? So not only are you accountable to your agency and accountable to the grant, but you're also accountable to the people that you're working for and working with, instead of the other way around, that they're working for, helping you out. Like, while, there might be some truth to that, you're really helping them and really helping to impact your community in that way. So these are helpful ways to capture how you're doing and to check in with one another. Assessment is something that you'll have to keep coming back to, so you can collectively decide with the folks in your programming what's working and where you can change things up. So you can take pictures of activities that you'd like to do or that you have already done and debrief about them, right? How did it go? Where could we improve, right? And you can even create your own online form using Google Forms to really assess where you're at, what your strengths are, what challenges you're experiencing, and potentially even goals, right? So, and then make sure to celebrate yourself after you've finished processing with your folks in your community, and maybe even internally with your agency, with your team. Just don't forget to celebrate yourself, because this is hard work and y'all are the folks on the ground doing it. We're here for support every single step of the way, but even if it's something so small success, right? I sent an email and somebody responded to me, right? Like, that is progress. So we're looking for progress, not perfection. So that's a nugget of wisdom. So here are some tools, especially virtually, especially if you're gonna wanting to meet with young people virtually, that you can utilize. So Nearpod is a tool that I recently heard about, maybe in the past 2 years, and it's almost like a bulletin board. Like it's instead, it's like a upgraded version of like PowerPoint. So it's not anything even close to this, but it's like very interactive. It's very visually appealing. It's very just nice, aesthetically nice to look at. I know they have different templates and things that you can choose from, or you can even create from scratch. I actually haven't had a lot of experience with Nearpod, but the times that I have seen it being used, it's super cute. So I recommend you look into that. Miro is another tool which, like, let's say you're meeting with a group virtually, and you want to do an icebreaker, for example, right at the start of your session or your meeting time. You ask folks, if you could be anywhere in the world right now, where would you be, right? And like, so that will show up on the screen, and like as folks are submitting their answers, you'll see it pop up in real time. So that's another really cool tool. And there's also other really cool stuff you can do in Miro. Like I was in a conference one time, and I could even upload pictures. Like, I don't know, it was really, really cool. But that's another tool that's super interactive. On Zoom itself, there's a whiteboard function. I definitely recommend Nearpod and Miro over this, but it's also there accessible to you if you don't have the capacity to really look into these other tools. Like that's there and available for you. You can draw on a whiteboard with your mouse. You can annotate. There's even little stickers that you can put. You can draw a little text box and then type in there. So that's also a really helpful tool. And you can also utilize the breakout group function in Zoom and test it out, see how it goes. Because from my personal opinion, and just like, or not even opinion, but just from my experience and what I've seen, some people don't really like breakout groups. So if it's not something that the folks you're working with are actually into, they don't, maybe get kind of nervous because it's a smaller group, and, maybe feels like there's a little bit more pressure to speak up, just test it out, see what works. And, this list isn't like exhaustive, right? There's a whole lot of other tools out there that you can utilize. So these are just a couple. And don't be afraid to enjoy the silence. Zoom fatigue is super, super real. And sometimes people don't have a lot to say. So there will be moments where you get little to no engagement. So embrace it and think of creative ways to reframe questions that were posed. Maybe that will help to get a little bit more engagement. Reflect back words of affirmation to your community, and reflect on all you've accomplished. And don't forget to ask questions. That's super important to get some form of engagement from the folks that you're working with, especially if it's virtual. Like, we know that working virtually, even though I feel like it's almost like the new normal, but it's hard. People get tired when they have to be online all the time. And at TASA, our team, we came out with a resource last year, which is called Virtual Reality, which is a guidebook. It's a really thick guidebook, like 97, I think, pages of how to do community level work virtually, right? Because we were in the middle of COVID when all this was happening. So a lot of research went into that, and we got a lot of testimonials from folks in the field who were doing community level work virtually, and really sharing a lot of their trial and error and successes, what was working for them in their communities in that virtual reality. Drop in the chat if you don't have access to it, if you don't have that, and I can send it to you. We have physical copies, so hopefully we can get one mailed out to you. But if not, I have a virtual copy I can email you today. Or actually, well, yeah. as a follow-up to all of this, I'm gonna send y'all the slides, the recording for this, and I can send y'all the virtual reality guidebook as well. But because it's gonna take time for this video to like to download and all that, I'll send it Monday. So and we're almost done, y'all. That was all the content. So now we're just gonna close out with an activity. Thank y'all so much. We're gonna wrap up with this photo card activity. We finished before the end time. So select a card from the options that I'm gonna show you in the next slide that captures how you're feeling about the training and our time today. Feel free to unmute yourself, type it in the chat. Which one of these pictures really shows how you're feeling after today? And why? The tree. Why the tree, Edward? Only if you're comfortable sharing.
The tree, because it kind of represents reaching out into the community, growing with knowledge,
I'm gonna say the Legos. Just because this is, it's a lot of information. There's a lot of great information that you can use to build on and to kind of develop this vision of sorts that we can grow our agency as well as our community in our response to sexual violence.
I love that. I think it probably says a lot about me that when you said the Legos, my mind went straight to like, when you like step on a toy or a Lego or something, where it's like all like paintball. That's where my mind went to. I love your answer though. It's very positive. Audrey says the turtle on the skateboard because I'm learning slowly, but I will eventually get there and it will be so amazing. I love that. That's so cute. That's so cute. And it's true. It's going to be slow, y'all. So be patient, be kind to yourself. It's going to be slow, but it is going to be amazing. The turtle on the skateboard, just letting myself soak in everything that was coming my way. Aw. The sunrise, because I had a lot of aha moments. Good. I'm so glad to hear that. Candy, because I'm so excited and energized to use everything as I'm learning it all. Oh, that's so amazing. The one where the silhouette is staring at the galaxy. Oh, I see that. I think of it as learning a bunch of knowledge that will hopefully inspire other people. Oh, I love that. Thank you all. That was so nice. Okay. I got one more. The gummies. To be honest, it was the first one to grab my attention, and I love gummies. But I have to link it to the training because there is a lot of interesting information that I will enjoy using in future projects with my agency. Me, how am I feeling? I'm feeling, I love all those pictures that y'all selected, but honestly, I feel like I'm like this water over here. And not even water, like let's pretend like it's tea or something, because I don't think I've talked this much in a very long time. And my throat is starting to hurt. So I need some tea or something after this. But this has been so fun, honestly. Like I'm super glad that y'all showed up and that you were really engaged. I was pleasantly surprised with how y'all showed up today. So I really appreciate it. You got this. You got this. And reach out to us if you have any questions. Like I said, there's no question too small. There's no question that we won't answer. Literally, if it's which color do you like more for our branding or something like that? You know, like it can literally be anything. So no worries at all. We got you. You got this. Any final questions? And while I got y'all here, if you could please, this thing's in the way. If you could, drop it in the chat. Where's my chat? If y'all could please fill this out, that would be so helpful for us and our team. I will also include this in the email that I'm going to send on Monday for the folks who had to hop off early. But if you could fill this out, it's an evaluation about the training today. I would greatly appreciate it. But are there any final questions? Seeming like no. If there are no questions, then thank you all so much for coming, training. I hope y'all have a great rest of your day, a great weekend. You got a friend in me. Reach out with any questions. We got you.
When the road looks rough ahead and you're miles and miles from your nice warm bed, you just remember what your old past said.
Bye everyone. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, you got a friend in me. You got a friend in me. You got a friend in me. You got trouble, and I got them too. There isn't anything I wouldn't do for you. If we stick together,